Money, that's all the people want to make.
Welcome to our Theological Institute, Church Holy Family Catholic Church. We are continuing a line-by-line study of the Gospel of Matthew with only 2 or 3 nights left of our study. We are up to chapter 21, and so we'll begin with chapter 21. Jesus comes to Jerusalem as King. Nancy, will you lead us out with chapter 21, verses 1 through 11? Jesus comes to Jerusalem.
Chapter 21, Jesus comes to Jerusalem. As they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage on the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go to the village ahead of you, and at once you will find a donkey tied there with her colt by her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say that the Lord needs them. He will send them right away." This took place and fulfilled of what was spoken through the prophet. Say to the daughters Zion, "See, your king comes to you, gentle and riding on a donkey, and on the colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had instructed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloak on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna, the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" The crowd answers, "This is Jesus, the prophet from Nazareth of Galilee."
Have we heard this story before? What Sunday of the year do we hear this story? The Sunday before Easter is Palm Sunday. So in Matthew's story, they have the story of a donkey and a colt. The donkey is significant only because when we expected the Messiah to come into town, we expected the Messiah to be a military ruler, and military rulers don't ride donkeys. Follow me? How do military rulers come into town? With their horses and chariots, with their army. So for a guy to come into town on a donkey, it would be like the Sancho Panza. Just would have been not what people expected.
Yeah.
So, the people, though, recognize him as king, which is why they cut the branches and placed them on the road. We have different stories. Matthew simply talks about cutting branches from the tree and laying them on the road. Of course, in tradition, we know them as palm branches. Why would they put palm branches on the road? You're covering a dirt road so that when the king comes, the king doesn't step on the dirt. Instead, in other gospel stories, it has the people taking off their coats and putting their coats on the ground as well. Here, step on my coat. I'd rather you step on my coat than to step on the dirt. And they sing, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Where have you heard all that before? Every time we go to Mass on Sunday, those words come from the gospel accounts of Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem. So, now the story is going to take a turn. We understand that Jesus is coming into which city? So he got the donkey in that city. What city is coming into? This is the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. What's going to happen in Jerusalem? He's going to die. He's going to be crucified in Jerusalem. So now we're like to the last week of Jesus' life, according to the accounts that are told. Jesus at the temple, things are not going to go well here, right? He comes into town, he's going to make people angry. Becky, this is Jesus at the temple, chapter 21, verses 12 through 17.
Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. "It is written," he said to them, "My house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him at the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the teachers of the law saw the wonderful things he did, and the children shouting in the temple courts, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they were indignant. "Do you hear what these children are saying?" they asked him. "Yes," replied Jesus. "Have you never read? From the lips of children and infants, you, Lord, have called forth your praise." And he left them and went out to the city to Bethany, where he spent the night.
So from Bethphage to Jerusalem to Bethany. Bethany, can you think of anyone who was from the town of Bethany? Have you heard of Bethany before? That was the town where we had the spinster sisters, Mary and Martha, and their brother who was raised from the dead, Lazarus. All of those were from Bethany. In the meantime, though, in this chapter, Jesus gets to the temple. Instead of going into the temple to pray, what does he do? He drives out all of the merchants and all the people who were buying things in the temple yard, and he continues healing people, in this case the blind and the lame. So all the religious leaders are now upset that he is just turning their religious system upside down. This helps us to explain why it is that Jesus died. When Jesus came into Jerusalem, he did not meet their expectations for the military Messiah that they were waiting for, and from the view of the religious leaders, he was causing trouble. They had to do something. Mario, that brings us up to the cursed fig tree, which is chapter 21, verses 18 through 22.
Okay. Jesus curses a fig tree. Early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again." Immediately the tree withered. When the disciples saw this, they were amazed. "How did the fig tree wither so quickly?" they asked. Jesus replied, "Truly tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what was done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done. If you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer."
Gotta love this story. So this is a story that we don't find in all the Gospels of Jesus cursing a tree.
I never heard that.
I wouldn't doubt if you've never heard it before, because it's not proclaimed on any given Sunday during the 3-year cycle. Jesus curses a tree. What happens to the tree?
Wizards.
It withers.
It dies.
And the disciples are like, "Dude, what happened here?" And Jesus turns it into a lesson on faith for whatever reason. If you had faith, you'd be able to do what I do. You could be able to make fig trees wither. You could even say to that mountain over there, "Mountain, move," and that mountain would jump into the sea.
That's not right.
It's not right. It's one of those interesting stories that Matthew has given us that causes us to scratch our heads and to think, what is Matthew trying to communicate here? Why would Jesus, a God of life, cause death for a tree for no apparent reason except for that the tree didn't have any figs?
He was hungry.
So imagine Jesus, imagine if we were to have whatever movie that we made about this scene, having Jesus look for a fig, no fig, and getting all testy and cursing the fig tree.
Something like I would do.
And the fig tree withers. Yikes. But it is fitting with Matthew's motif of bearing fruit. If you don't bear fruit, remember, you're going to be the axe is at the base of the tree. If you don't produce good fruit in your lives, you'll be cut down and thrown into the fire. Fits with that motif in Matthew that we've heard. That brings us up to verses 23 through 27, Rudy. This is the authority of Jesus question. Chapter 21, verses 23 to 27.
Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him. By what authority are you doing these things? They asked. And who gave you this authority? Jesus replied, I will also ask you one question. If you answer me, I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, where did it come from? Was it from heaven or of human origin? They discussed it among themselves and said, if we say from heaven, he will ask, then why didn't you believe him? But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the people, for they all hold that John was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. Then he said, neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things.
Gotta love this scene in the temple now. Jesus is teaching the people. Jesus has cleared out all the merchants. Jesus has been healing the blind and the lame. Now Jesus is teaching, and the religious leaders are asking him, what authority do you have to be teaching here in our temple? And Jesus, in ministry, I say always answer a question with a question, right? Someone comes to you looking for advice, answer a question with a question. Jesus says, hey, I'll answer that question if you answer my question. What authority did John the Baptist have to baptize people? Did that authority come from heaven? Did God give him that authority? Because if so, why didn't you believe him? Or did that authority come from human beings? You don't want to say that answer because all the people believe that his authority came from God. So they were trapped. It's a predicament. They don't know how to answer. How do we answer? You can't say it came from heaven because we didn't believe him. You can't say it came from humans because others did believe in him as a prophet. So it's a conundrum for them, and so Jesus has wiggled his way out of being able to have to say under what authority he was teaching. That brings us, Gloria, to the parable of the two sons, chapter 21, verses 28 through 32.
Question.
Vincent.
So, do people believe that John the Baptist was a prophet, or was he just John the Baptist? Because you have prophet Isaiah, you have prophet, other people that were called prophets, and they were saying pretty much the same thing. But why wasn't? Well, how do they categorize John the Baptist? Was he a prophet?
He was a prophet.
He was a prophet.
And in the Gospel of Matthew, what makes John the Baptist so interesting is that earlier in the Gospel, we heard them say, you know, who is this John the Baptist? Oh, he is Elijah come back from the dead. Remember that line? So not only is he a prophet, he's like a major prophet. He's Elijah. Elijah, the guy who stepped on the flaming chariot and was taken off into heaven, who never died, went up to heaven. Elijah came back in the form of this guy, John the Baptist. Dang. They were saying up to the parable of the two sons, Gloria, chapter 21, verses 28 through 32, the parable of the two sons.
What do you think? There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first and said, Son, go and work today in the vineyard. I will not, he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. He answered, I will, sir, but he did not go. Which of the two what his father wanted? The first, they answered. Jesus said to them, Truly I tell you, the tax collector and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the taxpayer and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him.
Parable of two sons then, was the difference between two sons? The father went to both sons, to one son and then the other son, and said, "Son, do you mind going out to the vineyard and work?" And the first son said, "No, I'm in the middle of a video game, can't you see?" So the son did not listen to his father, but then what happened? After he finished that game, he went out to the vineyard and worked. Made his father happy. The other son, he went to his other son, "Hey son, do you mind going out to the vineyard today and helping out a little?" And his son said, "Sure, I'll go and do it." Did he do it?
No.
Didn't do it. So Jesus is essentially likening them, the religious leaders of this, "Hey, yeah, I'll do it," to those who end up not getting into heaven, whereas all these prostitutes and tax collectors, all these people who seemingly aren't going to get into heaven, are the ones who are getting in. What a great story. I mean, Jesus suggesting that God is a God who has mercy on all of these prostitutes and tax collectors, gathers all people to himself, except, of course, for those righteous hypocrites who are, in this gospel, the Pharisees and the religious leaders. Yikes.
So some of us, I as a human, are too busy doing something else
Yeah.
besides,
No.
and we don't go to church anymore. So we're busy with something else, watching ball games or something, or having fun. I think that's when we make a difference. I'm going with that story. We're too busy doing something else, and we just don't listen sometimes.
Mm-hmm. In the moment, the question becomes, what does that mean at the end of your life? Because remember, Jesus already told that parable of how it was that the owner of the vineyard sent some people out at 6 in the morning and at 7 in the morning, 9 in the morning, at noon, 3 p.m., etc. And they all got the same just for going. The prostitutes and tax collectors are getting into heaven ahead of some of you Pharisees because they're turning toward God more so than y'all. Yikes, what a condemnation.
Can that be used as, can this parable be used as someone not believing in God?
Absolutely. Someone didn't believe in God their whole entire life. They said no to the idea of God. No. You believe in God? No. No, 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 no. You go to church with me? No. Their whole entire life. And yet, that person was the one who in the end came and said, you know what? I've never believed in God, but maybe there is some mystery in this universe that can't be explained, and maybe that's what people refer to when they talk about God. Oh.
What about if you throw another letter, another word into that, to where some people don't believe in a God exists? That you could use this parable as that too.
Sure. I think Jesus is warning us more than anything. The Matthean Jesus warns us against judging others, especially those people like prostitutes and tax collectors, because they're getting into heaven before the rest of you. You don't know what's in their hearts. Outward, there you are being all judgy, and God is looking at you and saying, "Oh, you judgy person! I'd rather be with them than with you."
And I have one more question. You keep saying a military messiah.
Huh?
If I can get my memory refreshed.
Huh?
Why were the Jewish people looking for a military messiah instead of what we look at as a God now?
Good question. I asked you to ask me that. Why would we do that? Because here we are. The Jews are in the middle of the Roman Empire. Here's Italy. Here's Greece. We're coming down to the Holy Land now. We're right down here in the boondocks of the Roman Empire. We hate being part of the Roman Empire. There's nothing that we'd love more as Jews than to throw off the shackles of the empire. And when the Messiah comes on his chariot with his army, we are going to overthrow the Roman Empire. Ooh, what an exciting day that's going to be. A day of liberation. Jesus disappointed the Jewish people, needless to say. He died. Ready for the parable of the tenants? Janie, this is chapter 21, verses 33 to 45. We'll let you read all of it, or if you want to turn to Terry Ann and whisper at any point that she should take over, she'll take her cue from you. The
Okay.
parable of the tenants.
All right. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard. He put a wall around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he rented the vineyard to some farmers and moved to another place. When the harvest time approached, he sent his servants to the tenants to collect his fruit. The tenants seized his servants. They beat one, killed another, and stoned a third. Then he sent other servants to them, more than the first time, and the tenants treated them the same way. Last of all, he sent his son to them. They will respect my son, he said. But when the tenants saw the son, they said to each other, "This is the heir. Let's kill him and take his inheritance." So they took him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Therefore, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? "He will bring those wretches to a wretched inn," they replied, "and he will rent the vineyard to other tenants, who will give him his share of the crop at harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone'? The Lord has done this, and is it marvelous in our eyes? Therefore I tell you that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit. Anyone who falls on this stone will be broken into pieces. Anyone on whom it falls will be crushed." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parable, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet.
The parable of the tenants. So what is this parable all about? Okay, there's a landowner who owns a vineyard and says, "Oh, I gotta go out of town, but I'll just rent out my vineyard." Rents it out. But we know, of course, that when Jesus tells a parable, Jesus is not talking about landowners and tenants in a vineyard. He's talking about something else. What's he talking about in this instance? He's talking about how it is that God gave God's vineyard to the Jewish people. And how did, and this sounds so terrible in the 21st century because we're not judging our Jewish sisters and brothers, but in Matthew's time, Matthew was pretty judgy. And Matthew was saying how it was that the Jewish people then, who were the tenants in the vineyard, beat and stoned and killed the prophets that God sent. So God sent more prophets into the vineyard of the Jewish nation.
Prophets.
And what did the Jewish leaders do? They beat and stoned and killed them too. And now, knowing that Jesus is in the last days of his life, Jesus is telling a parable about what's going to happen to him, because then the landowner sent his son, but we know it's not about a landowner, about the son. Who's the landowner? God sent his son. Sent who? Jesus, into the vineyard of the Jews. And what did the Jews do to Jesus? Matthew is quite clear in blaming them for Jesus' death. Yikes. And so in this parable then, God is going to take the vineyard away from those wicked people and give it to other people. Matthew was writing after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, so it was easy for him to say, "Hey, look, Jews, what happened? Your temple was destroyed. God is giving your vineyard to others. Yikes. Pretty harsh.
So was that almost basically saying the rise of a new religion?
Yeah. And that's the perspective that Matthew would have been writing from, because now this is Matthew, the Gospels were written after Paul's letters, after this new belief in this new way that they referred to as Jesus. They were Jesus people now, Christians.
So when was the word Christianity, basically, when was Christianity born? Was this before Jesus' death or this parable here?
Excellent question. So when was Christianity born? Many would suggest that it was born with the actual historical person of Jesus. I mean, it's grounded in that historical person. But we don't see the word Christian used to Christ's followers until later in the first century. So within the first 100 years, people are beginning to refer to themselves as followers of Christ.
Okay, so do some people get it mixed with this era or when, I can't remember his name, Peter set forth to build a church when he said build a church?
Yeah. So the challenge that we have is that Jesus lived from the moment that Jesus lived until the moment that Jesus died. Jesus died roughly 30 AD-ish. Matthew was writing his work, probably somewhere between 70 and 80 AD. So the question becomes, how much of the Gospels talk about this time period in which Matthew was living versus this time period in which Jesus was born? 50 years from now, when someone writes a book about Father Jamie, someone who's not in this room, who didn't even know him, you'll have to read that book and ask yourselves, how much of this was really about Father Jamie, and how much of it was made up by this person? This person is telling us that Father Jamie used to wear 2 different colored socks to Mass. I don't know about y'all, but I have never seen him do that. Follow me? How much is it that person who's writing about it versus the actual historical person? So you ask a very good question, Vincent, because for us now, 2,000 years later, it becomes this task of trying to sort these things out. Because obviously Matthew was living in a different time and likely never met Jesus, but is writing stories about him based on what he's heard. He's read the Gospel of Mark. He's heard other stories from a source that we haven't yet found called Keith. He's adding some of his own material.
Not to be funny or anything, but you just said sort things out. That's one of my questions every time I read the Bible at home. I always go back to you. The Bible is a book of theology, not history.
There you go.
So now it's like I'm sorting these things out.
What makes it tough for us is because when we're talking about this historical person, we have to ask ourselves, what about it? What about the stories that we hear are actually about the historical person versus the stories that we're told of him? The example that I'll use, for instance, is walking on water. I don't want to say that this guy didn't walk on water. I just want to say that if you write a story about me 50 years ago, please include the story of me walking on water. Remember that time that I walked across the swimming pool? Right? There are going to be various stories that are told of me that are going to be different from things that actually happened here in the real person. Walking on water, okay, we have to sort out, is that something, and each person has to make his or her or their own decision. I'd say there's no right or wrong answer here. There are all sorts of people in this world who believe that Jesus walked on water. There are other persons who suggest that, Matthew probably wrote a story like that for a reason, so that people would read that story, hear that story, and say, Jesus had God's power. Jesus could do anything to God. Jesus could heal. Jesus could calm storms. Jesus could do this. Jesus could do that. Mario?
Somebody somebody had to be telling those stories.
Someone was telling
for
those stories.
years and years and years.
Someone was passing down those stories. And Matthew, I don't think for a moment that Matthew made up anything.
We were,
Matthew is probably like, Father Jamie, a lot of the books that I write, it's not me making things up, it's just me recording things that other people say. Matthew is doing the same thing.
we were,
Ooh, that's a great story about Jesus. Do you mind if I write that down?
well, we were at the university. We were talking about Muhammad also, and a lot of the camel drivers would tell stories when they would sit around and talk, and they would say, "Oh, did you hear that? I mean, you know, Muhammad was quite a person. And he did these things and this." And I guess at that time there were no newspapers, nothing.
No cameras,
It was just
word of mouth, campfire stories.
they could just make it up, and we don't know.
Vincent, we do well to consider Vincent's words. The Bible is not a book of history, it's a book of theology. What is the author trying to tell us about God? I made a Facebook post yesterday about the number 777, Lamech. Noah in the ark, Noah's father, Lamech, lived to be 777 years old. Dang. He must have had a good diet. I would want to know what his secret was, right? Did the historical guy, Lamech, actually live 777 years? Or did someone who later wrote the story say that about Lamech, knowing that this was a symbolic number? The number 7 is a perfect number. 3 is a perfect number. 1, 2, 3. 3 sevens is a perfect number. Oh, Lamech lived to the perfect age of 777. Ask yourselves, how many people do you know who lived to be 777 years? Besides Becky's mother, who is on her way. She's a seventh of the way there. She's pushing. She's pushing for 777. How much of it is the real historical person versus the stories that are told about them? I tend to put a person living to 777 years, I tend to take that out of the historical box. It's not a story to be taken literally, not a book of history, a book of theology. This person was so holy that God let them here for 777 years.
Follow-up question. I may have asked this question when we were back off of 35.
Good, let's hear it again.
And Mario just brought it up, and it reminded me the story about people sitting around telling stories. My question is again, what is the difference between a folklore story and a theology story? Aren't they basically almost the same?
Yeah. In the American culture, we have various stories of folklore. Think about some of the stories that you may have heard as children. People like Johnny Appleseed. Now you have to just ask yourselves, I grew up in Ohio where we have apple trees. So of course I was told that those apple trees were planted by whom? Hello, Johnny Appleseed came through Ohio just throwing out apple seeds, and that's how we got all the apple trees. Okay, so you have to ask yourself, there's a certain folklore around this. How much of that is based in an actual person who lived and may have done some of those sorts of things versus the stories that are told about them? I'm trying to think of some of those other folklores. Wasn't there stories of like a man who like, say it again?
Paul Bunyan.
Paul Bunyan, right? Cutting down all these trees. John Henry. Was John Henry the one who was like
he was the one that built the railroad and the mountain, built through the mountains. So far in West Virginia area, they say that all the trains that went through the mountains are John Henry's mountains.
There you go. So did John Henry, the historical person, actually do this? Did Paul Bunyan, the historical person, actually do this? Versus or how much of that is shaped by the story? Those short stories are probably rooted in some real person somewhere at some time, right? I'm going to make this up. Paul Bunyan, it was rooted in Pablo, a really good guy who like cut down, but they got around the campfire and you give Rudy and Mario drinks and suddenly they are telling stories about how Pablo was like cutting down entire forests with a single swing of his axe, and they're laughing their they're laughing. And their kids and their grandkids are hearing these stories and passing them on to their kids and grandkids. And so then now we have this predicament of sorting out their stories, thank you Rudy and Mario, from poor Pablo, who was a good guy at cutting down trees, but he was just like he was like one of us. He put his pants on one leg at a time and he had his flaws. Now I'm not suggesting that Jesus put his pants on one leg at a time and that he had any flaws, but we do well to try to figure out to separate the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith that we believe in.
The professor in sociology was talking about things like that, like Muhammad was slaughtered, and his wife went to look for pieces of his body and put it together. I mean, it's a fact. It's not really true, but she went from place to place looking for parts of her husband.
All sorts of stories. Human beings are great storytellers, so we will forever tell stories. We no longer have campfires like we used to. I mean, literally every night was around a campfire. Now we don't do that so much, but just think of the stories that we continue to cling to. Vincent?
I know we need to move on, but just a little twist. What if the difference between folklore and, you said, faith? Okay, that's theology and folklore. What if Paul Bunyan used those trees, instead of just cutting the trees for just cutting the trees, used them to build all the churches in one area?
He did. You haven't heard that story? So what I'm hearing you suggest is that there is, getting back to some, there are various stories of folklore, but we don't believe that these stories of Jesus are folklore. And one of the reasons that we don't believe that is because ultimately these are faith stories. These are stories of faith, and every person has to decide what he or she or they is going to believe about these stories. Right?
But then you get to the question, do some people believe in Paul Bunyan or believe in, let's say, just throwing out John the Baptist? So how would you determine that being folklore and theology?
It's the same challenge we have separating the historical person from the stories that are told about that person, right? Another good example, now that we're in the month of December, is San Juan Diego. Have you heard of him before? Who is San Juan Diego? San Juan Diego, that was the guy that Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared to. When did Our Lady of Guadalupe appear? 1531. So he would have lived sometime leading up to and after 1531. When was the story of Our Lady of Guadalupe told? Well, obviously they wrote it down that very day. And they took pictures, and they put it in the newspaper that day? No. The story of Our Lady of Guadalupe came in 1648, and so we have to figure out, what does that mean for the story then? I'm doing the math. If that story is written 117 years after the purported event, then what does that mean for this interim of Mario and Rudy's, as much as we love them, their campfire stories? And I'm not suggesting that diminishes any part of the story. It's simply, for us as people of faith, it's to use the analogy from the gospel last week, it's separating the wheat from the chaff. What wheat are we going to take from this?
But we take stories that make us feel better and more faith and stronger. I mean, because like the professor used to say, too much love, we sing about that, and no love at all. We always sing the song.
And there are probably reasons for these stories. We just finished celebrating Thanksgiving. There's just something nice about the Thanksgiving story of pilgrims and Indians, the indigenous people, sitting down with one another and having fun and laughing at one another's jokes. That's the stories that we tell. And then historians come along and tell us that the real situation was probably a far cry from that. Those poor indigenous people and the ways that they were treated by people who were who were arriving from other places.
But the stories over there in that area, in Massachusetts, is that the Native Americans taught them how
How to grow corn,
how to survive,
how to make a good pumpkin pie, yeah.
and they bury the fish to make the corn, and also they didn't see in Europe you didn't have any turkeys, no turkeys. In the U.S. we got turkeys.
So how much of that is the stories that we tell versus what actually happened? I don't know. That's what we love about the stories of our faith, is that we are living 2,000 years after Jesus lived and after Matthew lived. There's no way that we're going to have a definitive way of separating out these. So it ultimately comes down to your faith. And I don't want anything that we're saying here this evening to be an obstacle in your faith. Everyone has his or her or their own beliefs. But anything, that's the beautiful thing about the human being.
But it's a positive story. I mean, I shouldn't say everything was positive, but for God to come over and save us,
Yeah,
I believe in that one.
there you go. Shall we move on to chapter 22? Chapter 22, that brings to the parable of the wedding banquet, Terry Ann. Chapter 22, verses 1 through 14, the parable of the wedding banquet.
Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to those who had been invited to the banquet to tell them to come, but they refused to come. Then he sent more servants and said, Tell those who have been invited that I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and fattened cattle have been butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet. But they paid no attention and went off, one to his field, another to his business. The rest seized his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his army and destroyed those murderers and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, The wedding banquet is ready, but those I invited did not deserve to come. So go to the street corners and invite to the banquet anyone you find. So the servants went out into the streets and gathered all the people they could find, the bad as well as the good, and the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing wedding clothes. He asked, How did you get in here without wedding clothes, friend? The man was speechless. Then the king told the attendants, Tie him hand and foot and throw him outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are invited, but few are chosen.
You gotta love this story because, again, Jesus is telling a parable, which means that Jesus is not talking about a real king and a real banquet, that Jesus is trying to teach us a lesson through this. So who is the king in this story? The king is God. The banquet, God is inviting people to a banquet. What is the banquet? Heaven. Okay? God is inviting people to heaven, but the people that God invited refused. Who were the invitees? The invitees the people who were invited, but said, no, that's okay. For Matthew, it would have been the Jewish people. Ouch. And you can see where a lot of the anti-Semitism, a lot of the sentiment against Jewish people is rooted in scriptures like this. They refused, so the king, God, destroyed those murderers and said, okay, invite anyone into the banquet. So suddenly the banquet hall is filling up with non-Jews, with Christians and others. But then the story takes a turn at the end where one person shows up, not dressed for the wedding, and the king says, excuse me? I invited you and you came like that? If you want to get into the banquet, heaven, then you need to be ready for the banquet. Are you ready for the banquet? What are you doing to prepare yourself for the banquet for heaven? Vincent?
Can you look at it as, instead of using the word the Jews, right, can we use those words who did not believe?
Yeah. Sure.
And then who didn't, when the believers were the ones that were invited,
Sure.
not the non-believers.
Sure. For Matthew, we know that he was very specific about who he was talking to. But yeah, we can. That's the beauty about parables, is that they can take on various meanings. Two people can read the parable and get different meanings out of it. That's the beautiful thing about it.
And I think that's what's happening in this world because of all the stuff going on about the I don't know, people just try to judge everyone for words that some people don't understand and other people understand it differently.
Yeah. And so it seems like this parable could be applied to other situations in our world or in our lives. Paying the imperial tax to Caesar. Heather, that brings us up to chapter 22, verses 15 to 22. The imperial tax to Caesar. Remember, the religious leaders are trying to catch Jesus. What are they going to say now, Heather?
Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. When they heard this, they were amazed. So they left him and went away.
Great story. They're trying to trap him now. Don't you just love the flattery that they begin with? Oh, teacher, we know that you're so wise. So tell us this. Shall we be paying the taxes to Caesar? Of course, it's conundrum. It says yes. Yes, we should pay the taxes to Caesar. Then the Jewish people could get upset with him. He says, no, don't pay the tax to Caesar. Then he's just committed an act of treason against the state. And so does he say yes or no? No. So he says, well, bring me a coin. Let's see who's on the coin. Who's on that coin? Caesar. Oh, that coin belongs to Caesar and Caesar's government. Give that coin to Caesar. Give to God what belongs to God. Think of all the ways that could be interpreted today. What are some of the things that belong to God? Got news for you. That shirt that you're wearing, does it really belong to you? That house that you live in, that car that you drive, does it really belong to you? We as Americans like to think that we own everything. But if you die, are you going to take it with you tomorrow? You're going to be pulling a U-Haul behind the hearse, filled with everything you have? Oh, I'm taking it with me. I'm going to take all my money with me. Got news for you. Give to God what belongs to God. That brings us up to marriage of the resurrection. Vincent, chapter 22, verses 23 through 33. Marriage at the resurrection. They're still trying to trip them up.
That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died. And since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The same thing happened to the second and the third brother, right on down to the 7th. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the 7, since all of them were married to her? Jesus replied, You are in error because you do not know the scripture of the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given marriage. They will be like an angel in heaven, angels in heaven. But about the resurrection of the dead, have you not read the God said to you, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. When the crowd heard this, they were astonished at his teaching.
Important distinction now. We've introduced this group called the Sadducees, who it says do not believe in the resurrection. That gives some important information. If Jesus was Jewish, in the same way that the Sadducees and the Pharisees and others were Jews, then what kind of Jew was Jesus? Did Jesus believe in the resurrection or not? Probably did. That puts him more in line with the Pharisees who believed in the resurrection. Did Jesus believe in angels or not? What does this passage tell us? Jesus is talking about angels. Sadducees didn't believe in angels either. So here we're seeing Jesus being painted more in line with the way of thinking that the Pharisees believed. And so these Sadducees, who thought differently, asked them this story about the brothers. Well, what if one brother, did you know how it was in the ancient times? If you married a woman and then you died, guys, that meant that your brother had the duty of marrying her to support her and to raise your kids. So what happens if one brother dies and then the next and then the next and the next and the next, and this widow, this woman, has survived 7 brothers. She's a widowmaker. Okay? In heaven, whose wife is she going to be? Is she going to be the wife of brother number 1, brother number 2, brother number 3, brother number 4, brother number 5, brother number 6, brother number 7? Whose wife is she going to be? Jesus said, no, they're thinking like the people of this world think. God doesn't think like that. When we die, we're going to be like the angels in heaven. And the angels in heaven don't get married. Just hate to break that to you, but the angels don't look before God and say, hey God, I found the love of my life, I'd like to get married. The angels don't do that. And what we love about this, it's subtle, but Jesus says, I am. When God in the burning bush talks about, God says, I am the God of Abraham and Sarah, the God of Isaac and Rebekah. I am. God wasn't speaking in the past tense. I was the God of them, but then they died. No, I am. For God, we're all present tense. We're alive. Those who have died and gone before us continue to be. And we can't think of them as being dead, or in the same way that we think of people in this world, oh, whose wife is she going to be? No, y'all aren't thinking like God thinks. You're trying to trap me up. You're trying to trip me up. Trying to trap me. Not going to happen. But we do know where the story is going, right? What's going to happen in the end of the story? Jesus is going to die. So after Jesus comes into Jerusalem, upsets the religious system at the temple, now they're looking for ways to trap him. That brings us up to the Great Commandment. Remind me, where did we just leave off?
Top of page 25.
Page 25.
Becky.
Oh, me.
Is
Oh,
Becky?
sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
Becky, sorry about that. Becky, the greatest commandment then,
Hearing,
verses 34 through 40, sorry.
hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees and the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments.
Still trying to trip him up. Of the 613 rules that we live by, Jesus, which one is the most important? Jesus gives him a straight answer. Number 1, love God. Number 2, love your neighbor as yourself. We talk about that every time we talk about the cross, right? Cross has 2 beams, one pointing up, one pointing to the side. Make sure that you're loving God. make sure you're loving that person beside you, and if you're doing that, then you're following in the footsteps of He who died on a cross. Jesus told us to love God and love that person beside you. We bring chapter 22 to an end with whose son is the Messiah, Mario, verses 41 through 45 of chapter 22.
Okay. Then Jesus said to the crowd, to his disciples, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses.
Awesome. Let's just back up to whose son is the Messiah.
I'm sorry.
No worries. Verse 41.
41?
Yeah.
Okay. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? The son of David, they replied. He said to them, how is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemy under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one could say a word in reply. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions.
So all that simply to say that all of these religious leaders who are trying to trip Jesus up, who are trying to trap Jesus, now bring this complex thing that you have to think a little bit about. Whose son is the Messiah? Well, the Messiah is the son of David. Okay, so here's David. Let's see. The Messiah is the son of David. Okay, I'm understanding that. But then the scriptures, the Psalms, say the Lord David, who wrote the scriptures, talk about the Lord. So how can the Lord be both David's, above David and below David? So essentially, the message that Matthew wants to take from this is that Jesus was so smart that all the Pharisees and scribes and Sadducees, the religious leaders, none of them could pull anything over him because he was just smarter than them all. No matter what they would say, he had a comeback.
Those are drop the mic.
Yeah, Jesus said, drop the mic moments. Okay, Sadducees, your turn. He gives them a response. Boom, drops the mic. Who's next? Pharisees? Pharisees, welcome. What's your question? Gives them a response. Boom, drops the mic. And they're all just like reduced to silence. Or, as it said previously, they're just so amazed that no one could dare ask them any more questions. Matthew is painting this picture of Jesus as being so wise and all-knowing that it was worthless to try to question him. Quick time check. How are we doing on time?
5 minutes. 5 minutes before 9.
5 minutes before 9. We'll call it at chapter 23. We'll pick up at chapter 23 again. But we have 2 more nights left for us to be able to get through chapters 23, 24, and 25. And then after that, 26, 27, and 28. So 2 more nights of the Gospel of Matthew in January. Vincent?
Real quickly before we go.
January.
How would you explain,
January.
well, going back a couple of, when they're saying that
January.
the question I just also, Jesus talks about angels, and then that we all gonna be like angels and stuff like that. How can you tell? How can you? Well, not explain, but someone that says, "I'm going forward to go see my other half," even though she was married to 7 guys,
Right.
and she's not gonna go, but she's gonna be an angel. And some people believe that other halves are gonna go see their loved ones, their mom, their dads, or whatever. But in this story, it's just saying that everybody's gonna be an angel, which is a good thing because we're all angels. But how can I had the question, I lost it.
Yeah, so it's hard because we think as human beings think. Follow me? You know, we think about Gloria and Rudy being a happy married couple, and so lovey-dovey with one another. Then when they get to heaven, they're gonna be like, oh, kissing on one another for all of eternity. Jesus, like, yeah, but it's not heaven. You can't think like a human being. The things in heaven are gonna be exactly like they are on earth. You can't think that we're gonna have streets and houses and a picket fence in the yard. You just can't think like human beings think.
Well, then you're saying, I mean, I always think of myself as going to heaven is to see my daughter. But I'm not going to see my daughter.
No, Jesus doesn't say that. But what Jesus does say is that some of the ideas that we have of heaven, that heaven is probably not going to be like that. We here on earth, we'll argue about whose wife she was because she married 7 guys.
Oh, yeah, that's
In heaven, it's not going to be an issue.
Because I was going back to like that story.
Yeah.
I was going back to what Becky had said a couple of studies ago. That Father Roy said that once we pass, we're not actually gonna go. And it just clicked on the light with me.
Yeah, so it's us. It's not.
And now this
We're not able to
explains it.
imagine. So when Rudy and Gloria are one day in the kingdom of heaven, do we imagine them being like they are today? You know, all sorts of jokes are told about things like golfing in heaven and things like that. So we can imagine Rudy golfing in heaven. Jesus is simply warning us, yeah, you might want to be careful because when you get to heaven, it's a mystery. And so
It's just what you want to believe. I mean, what makes you feel good.
That's
I mean,
probably as well put as anything,
Yeah.
right? We come up with various ideas that we just kind of like throw out there of what we'd like to think. Well, boy, Rudy would like to think that heaven is just 18 holes of golf every single day. And Gloria's thinking, yeah, I think my idea of heaven is something different. And Rudy's thinking my idea of heaven is no more dry wood and decorative ornaments. We all have different ideas for what it is that heaven's going to be like. And Jesus is simply warning us, yeah, hold on to that thought and be willing to be surprised. When you get to heaven, be willing to be surprised.
Really gonna beat Tiger Woods.
Give me your life.
Enough for one night. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, a world without end. Amen. Join us. Not next week. Next week, then, we'll take a break for our annual holiday party. We'll be back in January.